All right, welcome everyone. Happy Valentine's Day. Thank you for joining us this evening. On this occasion of the third event in the 2023 Public Lecture Series at the University of King's College, revolving around the theme of representations of colonization and decolonization. I am Justina Spencer, a white settler who lives and works here in Mi'kmaq as an assistant professor at the University of King's College in the Early Modern Studies program. Before we introduce our guest speaker this evening, following in the traditions of Mi'kmaq, I would like to pass the microphone over and welcome Catherine Martin, who is a member of the Millbrook Mi'kmaq community. She is presently the Director of Indigenous Community Engagement at Dalhousie and a Board of Governor for Kings. Catherine, thank you.
Is there really a mic there?
There is a mic.
Oh, but I'm mic'd.
Yeah, and our voices project fairly well.
Yes, I'm warning our camera people to make sure I don't blow your ears off. Okay, midawaloktiok. Nin gadalanan malta in Welagiskuk. And someday, you'll be able to take that course at King's. Right, President? Mi'kmaq course. My name's Catherine Martin, and I am a member of the Millbrook Mi'kmaq community, which is located in the middle on either side of the Trans-Canada Highway. There used to not be a Trans-Canada Highway going through our reserve. Highway 2 went through our reserve, and then they put the Trans-Canada through the other part. Anyway, that's where I come from. Happy Valentine's Day. When I taught at university a few times, one of my classes was, I don't know which one it was, that I would tell them all to look up this holiday or this event day and come back and tell me all about what you've learned about the true meaning of Valentine's Day or whatever. So, Google it. It's strange how Valentine's Day has become a place where we give people hearts and candies and sweets when that wasn't the original intent of that day. So I'm not telling you anymore because I have to grade you when you submit that. Yes, I'm happy to be here tonight, and I'm going to have to slip out and slip my way home because it's starting to get a little icy, but I'm going to listen. And what is it about King's that I love? Well, I love the new building. Yeah, it's not new to a lot of you, but it is to me. I mean, it's beautiful. And I just like that this King's, I like that King's is a journalism type school, and I'm a filmmaker, so I like that part too, and I really want to know a little more about this subject. We're all here because of our ancestors, yours and mine. My ancestors have welcomed people for 14,000 years to Mi'kmaq, to the Ulnu territory, and so I continue that tradition because that's the number one, the basis for our governance is to treat everybody like family and share everything we have. What a fundamental belief system that could have changed the world if it caught on when people arrived here. Hey, let's just share the land. Let's not be paying 5,000 times the price for houses today because it's kind of a game for people to be buying and selling and paying the lawyers and buying and selling and buying and selling for titles that don't exist. But I'm just letting you know that ahead of time, that it's something I figured out, that we're buying land that has never been given up, which is the whole point of why we continue to say, welcome to our territory. And I'm really pleased that people like Bill, our president, make sure that he acknowledges that. And it may seem simple, but it's huge for us that after 500 years, we've got people actually acknowledging it. Anyway, I'm not the lecturer, so I'm going to move on and welcome you in our traditional way. Sarah Denny of Eskasoni was a woman who was known to many of us, and she taught us a lot of things, a lot of our dances and our songs by rote. She just said, you, come on, and we would all have to go and listen and dance whichever way she told us to, or sing or drum. And that was important to her. She led her life, committed her life to bringing back and teaching everybody, starting with her own 12 children, those things that we weren't allowed to learn in public. We did learn, but not like we used to. So when it was safe in the 60s to begin to organize, to vote in this country, and organizing mean we could be in a community in the open and we could be seen talking to one another. It was legal after the 60s. In the Indian Act, it's illegal because because we weren't allowed to organize. So anytime there was more than two people, it would appear that we were coordinating or organizing, and weren't allowed to do that until the 60s. And so Sarah had carried our culture, our traditions, our sacred teachings for many, many years. And when it was safe to do so, she asked our Mi'kmaq Grand Council at the time if she could have permission to start to sing these chants. And there's two chants that she taught us to sing. And one of them is the feast chant, or a gathering chant, and we sing it when we bring nations, when all nations come together. So the drum represents the heartbeat of Mother Earth, and it also represents, I'm sorry to at least two moms in here who are carrying little babies. I'm sorry because the babies roll and jump around to the drum, and you'll find that. There's nothing I can do about that. Because the baby is hearing the drum beat, the heartbeat of their mother. And it's the heartbeat that all of you heard for a little while you were safe and snug and warm inside of your mom's womb. So those babies hear that, and they don't know why they're hearing their mom's heartbeat out here when it's usually there. It's also the first language that we were given. It's the language of our mother. It's the heartbeat. When we speak from our heart, we're speaking the language of our mother and of Mother Earth. And when we're doing that, it's the truth. So when we speak from our hearts, our mother's language, it's the truth. And the entire world understands this language. It's the first language that we know. Guano de, guano de, guano de, guano danahi, guanalia, guano danahi, guanalia, guano danahi. Guanalia, guano de, guanalia, guano de, guanalia, guano da, ego, igane, ego, igana. Deoka, deoka. Guanalia, guanodanai. Guanalia, guanodanai. Guanalia, guanode. Guanalia, guanode. Guanalia, guanoda. And with that, I'm going to welcome all of you for this evening. And I just want to mention that it is the time of the midwinter feast. And in our culture, and many others, but in ours we call it the midwinter feast celebration or ceremony. And so when I was singing, it's also a form of prayer when we drum and we chant. And when I was doing that, I was thanking all of the spirits who have brought us this far in the winter, because it's halfway, and we thank them and we feed the spirits and pray that by doing that, that we will make it through the rest of the winter. And so for 13,000-ish years, that was important every year. And we kind of got lost in the last few hundred because of a lot of the, it was illegal for us to sing, dance, speak, do ceremony, whatever. But we're bringing it back, and in the last 5 years, I've seen it just starting to grow. And it's not a bad idea for non-Mi'kmaq to do the same thing. It's very simple. Put a little plate of food out of the night that you're having your feast. You feed the spirits first outside, and it's just acknowledging what we should acknowledge every day, that we are alive, and so far, I hope this is real wood, so far we are able to eat and grow and fish the things that we need to eat. And I also wanted to ask us all to, in your own hearts, to send a good thought and a prayer off to the people of Syria and Turkey, because I just can't imagine. So, Walaliok, and I'll stop now. He asked me to talk long, so he didn't have to. No. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine.
How did that go?
He really responded to that. He did. I was going to say. Yeah, he just woke right up. Yeah. Thank you, Catherine. So on behalf of all the students and faculty and staff and alumni here at the University of King's College, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this third event in the series. The lectures, sorry, I keep forgetting to take my mask off. The lectures that make up this series cover topics including Indigenous settler relations, slavery in the North, and intersections between slavery and colonial violence against the Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotians in the Atlantic provinces. I'm very grateful that we as a community have the opportunity here to engage in our ongoing work of truth and reconciliation, and also to honor African Heritage Month, guided by the insights of leading researchers. To begin this work in good faith, I think it's fitting to state that King's as an institution was an instrument and product of colonization. We gather this evening on unceded Mi'kmaq land. As an institution founded in 1789, King's was established during the very years when the peace and friendship treaties of the previous 6 decades began to be ignored and systematically disregarded by the Crown and by the people and government of Nova Scotia. It is in this context that I acknowledge with humility and gratitude that King's is situated on unceded Mi'kmaq land in Chibuktuk and Nigmigmahi. I acknowledge also that African Nova Scotians are a distinct people whose histories, legacies, contributions, and communities have enriched Mi'kmaq and Nova Scotia for over 400 years. So we are tremendously fortunate to have this evening as our third speaker in the series, Professor Philip Zachernuk, Associate Professor of History at Dalhousie University. Professor Zachernuk earned his MA at Dalhousie before moving on to the University of Toronto, where he completed his PhD in 1991. He has held a Zora Neale Hurston postdoctoral fellowship at Northwestern University, a Calgary Institute for the Humanities postdoctoral fellowship, and a Shirk postdoctoral fellowship at York University. After teaching stints at the University of Alberta and Concordia University, he returned to teach at Dalhousie in 1995, where he is currently an associate professor in the Department of History. He is the author of Colonial Subjects, An African Intelligentsia and Atlantic Ideas, published by the University Press of Virginia in 2000, which examines the complex and shifting conversations about the question of Africa among Southern Nigerian intellectuals in the century before independence. The most recent of his many book chapters and journal titles in the Journal of West African History, published last year, is titled Contemporary Africans Meet Timeless Africa, West Africans' Engagement with Ideas of Africa in America, 1930 to 1950. His current projects are a study of the 19th century Black Atlantic intellectual Edward Wilmot Blyden, and a book examining how West African intellectuals in the 19th and 20th centuries worked to place Africa in the history of the world, created in and for the European imperial age, a history which notoriously had little space for Africa. So this talk emerges from work done for that book. So please join me in welcoming Professor Zachernuk.
Thanks, Catherine. Have a safe drive home. Thanks, Justina. Thanks to the King's College and the organizers of this lecture series for letting me be here. I'm quite interested in getting this talk across to you. I acknowledge, following on Catherine's thoughtful comments, that we meet on unceded territory and hope that this story about 80 years ago about West Africans in London is nevertheless of some value to people trying to trace and promote the process of decolonizing culture here in Mi'kmaq. I should say that I'm going to cough frequently during this. I'll have a ready supply of water here. Please forgive me in advance. And also that engaging this topic necessarily involves dealing with racist and potentially disturbing images, and I just wanted to put that out there so you can anticipate what's coming. There is much work to do to get past the colonial age with all its ramifications and legacies. I'd like to think my research and teaching have long been in line with those efforts. My focus has been on trying to understand how Africans, especially West African intellectuals, lived through the 19th and 20th centuries, which saw the creation, implementation, and end of colonial rule. This required for them rethinking and representing Africa in ways which defeated the many harmful myths and falsehoods which plagued both continental and diasporan Africans. It requires, for me, assessing how being colonial subjects affected their efforts to understand Africa and explain it to the world, and of course, to defeat those harmful myths. My worry is that we too readily approach decolonial work as if it's a self-evident project. That is, that it's somehow a matter of discarding toxic colonial ideas so as to uncover latent decolonial ideas, restoring decolonized subjects to a wholeness colonialism had damaged. We also, I think, too readily narrate the story in a framework of resistance. That is, we assume that because this work pushes against colonial ideas, it is a story of direct battles with colonial culture. These, I think, are shaky premises. That the need to decolonize is obvious does not mean the path there is also obvious or direct. To fight the powers of colonialism, colonial intellectuals, per force, had to meddle with the language and images through which those powers operated. This can be a complicated and unpredictable process. This talk is about appreciating a watershed moment in late colonial West African history, connected to a 1946 feature film produced by the British Colonial Office, Men of Two Worlds, and related to and about related cinematic depictions of Africa. Some unusually rich archival material allows us to trace a multi-sided process through which two recurrent and central figures in British colonial culture had to be reimagined: the good African and the witch doctor. The need arose because of a sharp and major shift in colonial policy from complacent preservation to ambitious intervention, a shift which unintentionally helped end colonial rule by the 1960s. West African activists in London seized on an unexpected opportunity to reshape these figures, but telling this story as a straightforward battle of the colonized versus the colonizer misses the messy mixture of achievement, appropriation, frustration, and compromise involved. Their work involved engaging with the ideas at hand, opposed, sympathetic, and sometimes just overlapping, challenging what could not be ignored, and seeking to realize the potential of others. This story of ideas bouncing around between die-hard British imperialists, liberal critics of empire, diasporan Africans in London, and West Africans, I hope, reminds us that decolonial work is done by people in certain contexts, with certain ideas available, but not others. Whatever is achieved will be marked by the entangled circumstances of its creation. Between the world wars, witch doctors were familiar, but not uncontested, figures in British, American, and African-American cinema, African-American images of Africa. For example, in the popular fiction by people like Edgar Wallace and Rider Haggard. Adventure films set in and celebrating British Empire, often called Empire cinema, flourished at this time, frequently based on such novels. Many of these stories feature witch doctors deploying magic to excite fear among African commoners and to challenge colonial authorities, representing the dark forces assumed to enslave the continent. Their recurrent defeat at the hand of white heroes dramatizes the justification for colonial rule, the need to destroy evil old Africa in the name of civilization. Good African figures, by comparison, were rare. Empire cinema celebrated white heroes proving their manhood. When Africans fighting these same battles appear, they were almost always dependent inferiors, often servants or loyal chiefs, dutifully accepting European tutelage to tame Africa, figure reduced to the background. These characters often reflected the disdain real colonial officials often expressed about Western-educated Africans upon whom their administrations relied, disdain for their perceived crude mimicry of European culture. The 1935 Empire cinema classic, Sanders of the River, directed by Zoltan Korda, and produced by the Korda brothers, is a good place to start the story of tracing the reinvention of the good African and the witch doctor. Although it featured, for the times, rare footage shot in Africa, not only of African wildlife, but also of Africans' ceremonial and working lives, these scenes simply served as a backdrop for a very familiar plot. Sanders, the heroic and avuncular district commissioner at the DC, defeats a rebellious slave-dealing chief waging war against neighboring tribes. Sanders' key ally is the naughty Bosambo, who, always appearing bare-chested in a leopard skin loincloth, holds Sanders in awe, and in the end is grateful to be appointed a colonial chief. This brief clip, if it works, I hope gives you a of their relationship.
What's the trouble? I'm sorry, sir, but I just can't manage these girls. Why? I should hear the things they say, especially about Bozambo. Here, come along. Come outside, girls. Come on, all of you. Come on. Outside. Now then. Has anybody hurt you since you've been here?
No, Lord.
Don't you want to go back to your fathers and your mothers?
No, Lord.
Oh, what do you want?
Marry the chief.
Well, all 10 of you?
Yes, Lord.
He's a great chief. He can build 10 huts.
He's great enough for 10 wives.
But don't you know that he has 5 wives already in another village?
No, Lord.
Well, they're old and fierce. Wouldn't they beat you?
They would, Lord.
Wouldn't they make you carry wood and water?
Yes, Lord.
Yes, well, you go back to your fathers and your mothers. If you obey my Lord Tibbets here, no one will harm you.
Yes, Lord.
You ought to be 10. Where's the 10th girl?
She has gone to the chief's house to look through the magic glass.
How do you know?
First day, I went to the chief's house and looked through the magic glass.
Second day, I went to the chief's house and looked through the magic glass.
The third day, I
Ah,
went...
that'll do. All right, carry on, please.
How dare you! Get out of here!
Senators of the River was a box office hit, but it also generated protests from diasporan Africans in both New York and London. Marcus Garvey organized one in London. The most substantial response might have been from Paul Robeson, the Black American actor who actually played Bozambo. Robeson was at this time already an established international figure, well-connected in Black London, widely known for his concerts of African-American spirituals and for stage and film performances, which challenged harmful Black stereotypes. Robeson had signed on to the Cordes Project on the promise it would present the richness of African culture. Betrayed by the actual film, he responded with the 1936 film, The Song of Freedom, in which he played the leading role. John Zinga is a Black British dockworker, blessed with a wonderful singing voice, because it's Paul Robeson, descended from exile rulers of a fictional West African kingdom. Discovered by a theatrical agent and becoming successful as a concert singer, he recalls his African heritage from deep memory, from a song in his deep memory. Zinga returns to his homeland, confronts and defeats the witch doctor, who had usurped the Zinga line, and sets his people on the road to progress, to modern medicine, education, honest rule, scientific agriculture, funded by proceeds from his singing career. Here's the defeat of the witch doctor.
What's he doing, John?
The usual business. Scaring the minds of those poor fellows with superstitious nonsense. That's what's keeping them back. What's Ndobo say?
He's saying that the spirits are angry that you've come to the island. He's telling the people they must drive you away.
Oh, is he?
Be careful, John.
I've got to put a stop to this straight away. Don't you see, honey? They think I'm afraid we'll never get anywhere.
Don't go into that circle.
Why not?
It is taboo. It would mean death for you.
Death. I suppose they think it means death, too. Well, let them see. Now you can tell them. Tell them that all this is finished. Tell them that I am their king, that I bring them a better magic, the magic which they can all learn. Tell them if they will trust me that there is much we can do together, that we can become a great people.
Robeson's concern with Sanders of the River, it seems, was not with the need to defeat old Africa, but rather with awarding Sanders the role of savior. Robeson wanted to put the salvation of Africa in the hands of a different good African, a talented and brave returning son. Robeson remained proud of this film. It fit comfortably in a larger Pan-African tradition, which argued the uplift of Africa could be promoted by the return of its diasporan children as agents of modernity. In keeping with the spirit of the Harlem Renaissance, it also found in African music proof of Africa's cultural riches, and that they could be harnessed for progress. But Zinga's triumph also parallels the colonial assumption that Africa will be unable to rise on its own without external guidance. These two films, Sanders of the River and The Song of Freedom, we shall see, figure prominently in the rethinking of our colonial culture figures in the 1940s. As Britain entered World War II, failed colonial development, headlong social change, and African challenge rattled their interwar complacency. Before this, colonial policy had focused on minimizing change, maintaining revenue, and keeping order. It relied on colonial chiefs and pushed educated Africans aside. The new vision, in sharp contrast, called for actively invasive social engineering intended to make African colonies more productive. This dawning era of, as it was called, the era of colonial development and welfare, the Colonial Office also realized, would require the active participation of those very educated Africans previously ridiculed. As various policy initiatives unfolded, the Colonial Office recognized that the old colonial culture would not suit future needs. They therefore proposed in 1942 to create Men of Two Worlds, a blockbuster feature film with British film stars in Technicolor, which was a new thing, which would pervasively project a revised colonial culture to serve the new policy. For all that, this new policy remained true to the basic Colonial Office claim, the claim on which imperial authority rested, expressed effectively in a 1939 government documentary. Life under the hot African sky was once a life of fear and uncertainty. British rule brought peace, but there is still a long battle to be fought with ignorance, poverty, and disease. And that was the new British mission, to save Africa from its ignorance, poverty, and disease. Men of Two Worlds was to give this message the cinematic punch of Sanders of the River, while introducing a new good African as a junior partner in this mission. The initial film treatment by a Colonial Office staff member, Arnott Robertson, simply adopted a well-worn plot device, the defeat of the evil witch doctor by a colonial official, by adding a good African helper to the conquest. The central character in the story is District Commissioner D.C. Shearforth, struggling valiantly to rescue Africa. Never given a name, the witch doctor is familiar, a, quote, old African with a cavernous face like a skull who wore wild catskins and charms about his arms and legs. This is an 1888 sketch of the same idea from a Rider Haggard novel. He does not practice useful medicine, but once buried an infant alive as a sacrifice to control locusts. Shearforth challenges the witch doctor to kill him by magic or be discredited. The curse fails, Shearforth lives. But the witch doctor dodges defeat by explaining he has no power over Europeans. The good African then steps up to play his role. He's the village school teacher, Hale, a local man who had spent 10 years at Achimota College in colonial Ghana. Hale rises to the challenge, fully aware of its immensity, as he laments to Shearforth, for more than 10,000 years, my people have been in Africa, where the ground is soaked in blood and alive with the terror and magic made of spilt blood. You can't wipe out 10,000 years of education. 10,000 years, you can't wipe out 10,000 years with 10 years of education. Under the curse, quote, holy African in his distress. He only survives because Shearforth props him up, prompting Hale to invite even more British assistance. What you can do, what you must do, is to stand by us and make it possible for us to come forward, the African doctors and teachers, the new Africa that will fight the old evils with the science and the knowledge which you brought. The witch doctor was from Empire Cinema Central Casting. The good African Hale, for all his bravery, remained a grateful and dependent junior partner. But where did he come from? Where did that invention come from? It's very clear that Robertson, the staff writer, clearly modeled him on J.E.K. Agrey, a famous Ghanaian educational reformer who returned from a long career in the United States to help found Achimota College in Ghana in the 1920s. Agrey and Achimota, resisted by conservatives, foreshadowed nonetheless the colonial education policy that the new colonial development and welfare era would require. Hale, the character, quotes Agrey at length, stressing his most famous message that progress in Africa required harmony between black and white people, just as piano melodies required playing both the black and the white keys. The League of Colored Peoples, a largely black Caribbean but also West African membership in London, one of the central voices for Black London, titled its journal "The Keys" as a tribute to Agrey's message. So moderate, committed to educational reform, Agrey provided Robertson a ready-at-hand new good African. Officials in the colonial office, not surprisingly, raved over this, quote, excellent empire propaganda, dramatizing the struggle against, quote, the sinister witch doctor. But as it happened, the people hired to develop the film were not going to be colonial office insiders. Torrell Dickinson was hired as director, already a notable figure in British commercial cinema, hard to get a hold of, in fact. And he, in turn, hired the successful novelist Joyce Carey as the writer. Two things recommended Carey: his 1941 Liberal Party pamphlet pushing for more ambitious colonial development, The Case for African Freedom, and the fact that his 1939 novel, Mr. Johnson, based on his experiences as a colonial official in West Africa during World War I, had established Carey's reputation among British readers as a man who understood the real Africa. Carey and Dickinson would challenge the staunch conservative official position with their liberal imperialist sensibilities. If some colonial office staff struggled with the shift in policy, Carey and Dickinson embraced it. Their position was that the empire, of course, had to be ruled, but it had to be ruled better. Africa didn't need tending, it needed urgent invasive change. Dickinson in a previous film, and Carey in his African novels, had satirized rather than lionized colonial officers and mocked their limited vision. Their racism was also different, explaining Africans' failings not by inherent inferiority, but by debilitating circumstances which could be overcome with proper effort. But much of their view remained unchanged. Africa, if a land of potential, remained blighted by ingrained backwardness. For Dickinson, Africa lagged 2,000 years behind the West in a, quote, age-rotten, primitive condition. Carey asserted that colonial education, quote, should give the African the best of Europe in art and literature and science, of course. It should also give him his own history and mythology. And of course, it should also give him his own mythology and arts. But as Carey also held that Africans lived, quote, in a museum of disease and frustration, it seemed that giving Africans their own mythology and arts wouldn't be giving them much. So what did these filmmakers do with the good African and the witch doctor they had been given to work with? They had been asked to make into a film. Striking changes to the two characters appeared in the film treatment Carey and Dickinson submitted in April 1943 after touring widely in Africa looking at filming locations. The plot remains similar. It concerns a government effort to relocate a village in the name of development. When the DC and the good African push, the witch doctor objects and places his curse. The witch doctor, now named Magole, remains the familiar exotic figure, quote, in full witch doctor dress with kilt and big silver rings. But he is both an ancient institution and a former railway clerk, adding to his menace the bête noire of many colonial administrators, the dangerous, malcontent, semi-educated clerk. The good African figure, now named Kasenga, is a government scholarship student who had studied music in London for 4 years, showing great promise as a composer in the European tradition. He forgoes his musical career, however, honoring his promise to return home to teach. This is a remarkable change, and many involved in the project found it jarring. Kasenga, I would suggest, is a huge leap from Mr. Johnson, the title character of Carey's famous 1939 novel. And the cover pages of this novel might give you a sense. The character, Mr. Johnson, is working as a semi-educated colonial clerk away from his home. He's childlike, he's impulsive, he's a man out of place, a man with no sense of his own history. But he's clever. He runs himself into debt, haphazardly mimicking a European lifestyle. Debt leads to theft, which leads to the accidental murder of a European, which leads to Johnson's legal execution at the hand of the DC. But how did Dickinson and Carey get from Mr. Johnson to Kasenga? They got there by looking to contemporary Black London. One clear model was Phyllis Shwande. He was celebrated in London jazz circles. He was also noted for his church music and orchestral compositions. For example, his African Suite, written in 1930. He was trained in Nigeria and then came to London in 1935. He would later become internationally noted as a creator of African art music. Shwande thought exposure to African music would erode British anti-African prejudice. And he also sketched a theory about African musical development, which evoked a Gray. African music, while established but essentially intuitive, should be developed by the careful application of Western musical structures. His achievements and interests suited the Colonial Office so well, in fact, that soon afterwards, Shwande himself was hired to be the musical advisor for the Colonial Film Unit. The second model for Kasenga was Robeson. Beyond his artistic fame, he was a celebrity in Black London political and social life, active with the League of Colored Peoples, and a substantial patron of the West African Students' Union. In fact, he paid for their second hostel. Before Dickinson was hired, Colonial Office discussions about the film had mentioned Robeson. More directly, his character John Zinga from The Song of Freedom meshed easily with Dickinson and Carey's needs. Zinga's return to rescue his ancestral home reinforced their insistence that Africa needed outside help. That Zinga did this by defeating the witch doctor only made the fit tighter. That Shwande and Zinga were musicians, rather than, say, medical doctors, was also convenient. Their inspirational contribution to African development could be kept well separate from the hard skills of the British. With this story in hand, in April 43, the filmmakers thought they had successfully fixed the flaws in the original, backward-looking story. But the revisions did not end there. Needing a female actor to play a minor role in the film, the filmmakers approached the West African Students' Union, WASU, in London to help. WASU was a leading voice of West African thought, in particular in Black London. At the heart of the empire was where the Colonial Office would turn to get a sense of African opinion. Ladipo Solanke, a Nigerian law student and scholar long at the helm of WASU, was instantly aware of the potency of this film project. He agreed to help only if WASU could review the script. In an extended series of memoranda, meetings, and informal conversations through the rest of 1943, from at least April through to late November, Solanke explained his disapproval in various ways. Recalling the protests against Sanders of the River, his broad point was that the story so badly misrepresented Africa's actual law and customs that it would, quote, cast a slur on the prestige of African peoples and prejudice Africans against the empire. The witch doctor was especially egregious. Solanke insisted simply that there is no such thing as a witch doctor in African law and custom, of which he was a scholar. It is an entirely European invention. Many Africans believed in witches, he agreed. But Africa had indigenous medical practitioners which colonial governments had recognized for their effectiveness curing people. Solanke asked that recognition be accorded actual African medicine as something imported scientific knowledge could improve and make, quote, consonant with modern ideas and higher standards. Shelenki therefore wanted the witch doctor entirely removed to be replaced by a second good African character. He suggested a story set in the very early colonial period in which this critical thinker would argue for the British to leave as soon as possible, while Kasenga would argue for a longer and implicitly more transformative reign. Instead of the superstition versus science structure of the propaganda film, Shelenki's story would turn on a disagreement between two African political factions and the DC's attempt to manage it. These revisions addressed several West African issues. While very aware that Dickinson and Carey's thinking at best overlapped with the ambitions of West Africans, of his peers, Shelenki hoped the film, with all its intended impact and its budget, might actually advance some useful changes. But he took a stand against the persistent belief that Africa's problem was its backwardness, which only foreign intervention could end. His position, shared by his peers, was that while external assistance was needed, African development should come fundamentally from within. Further, that Africans should determine what to assimilate by their own criteria. Finally, he addressed the concern West Africans faced within Black London between West Africans and diasporan Africans, concerning questions of Africa as distinct from questions of diaspora or Pan-African questions. Although they shared the fight against British anti-African racism and they shared a broad Pan-African solidarity, both pursued through the League of Colored Peoples, West Africans could be sensitive to being overshadowed and misunderstood by their friends. An anecdote tells of a West African student at Oxford from an elite Ghanaian family, visiting the set of Sanders of the River in 1935, and he challenged Robeson there for playing Bosambo in a Tarzan-style loincloth. And that picture becomes quite well known. That costume becomes quite well known. Robeson apparently responded by saying, well, what would you wear in Africa? Tweeds? And this guy says, yeah, that's what we wear. Elite Ghanaian family. In 1943, the British government put out a film called An African in London, which roused West African protest, not least from Wasu, because the lead role was filled by someone from the Caribbean. Robeson's Song of Freedom, depicting the rescue of Africa via cosmopolitan returnees, had been dismissive of African abilities to solve their own problems. Shelenki's revision would place West Africans on the screen as the key players solving Africa's problems. Some in the Colonial Office, unironically, thought these revisions too much like propaganda, and evidence of the West Africans' pathetic, quote, inferiority complex, which blinded them to the common sense truth that a film on Africa would necessarily reveal, quote, the primitive beliefs of colored peoples. But others pushed back, aware they had to win African endorsement. The filmmakers were asked, indeed, to consider recasting the theme of the film so as to take some account of these representations. The Witch Doctor was repeatedly amended through 1943, but not abandoned. Wasu had buttressed their rejection of the Witch Doctor in a memorandum, citing various missionary and medical experts, both African and expatriate. Colonial Office officials responded by rallying African opinion to defend him. Opinions solicited from two diasporan Black Londoners deemed to be authentic Africans attested that witch doctors indeed held Africa in thrall. Dickinson and Carey affirmed that their film would not treat witchcraft, quote, a form of superstition still most powerful in Africa, with mysterious glamour. But Magoli did lose some magic. He now dresses like other villagers. Although descended from witch doctors, he's essentially a confidence man working by psychological methods. For example, he secretly sabotages the new bridge to convince the villagers it is cursed. Kasenga became a yet more accomplished figure with African nationalist interests. Previously, Kasenga's music had a, quote, distinctly European quality. Now, it became Africa-inspired. In the opening sequence of the script, his composition is performed at the British National Gallery. He becomes more of a social equal with the DC. They play Kasenga's composition together at the piano, evoking Agray's black and white keys in harmony. And again, it seems Shawande was the direct model. Around this time, the BBC Symphony actually broadcast Shawande's African Suite. However, this accomplishment was now deemed to have needed at least not 4 years of training in Britain, but 7 years of training in Britain by Kasenga. Significantly, the characters Magoli and Kasenga confront each other in debate, one of Solanke's requests. Magoli, you don't belong here, you belong to the whites. Kasenga, that's a lie. You know I came here to help my people. I want people to learn all the whites can teach. Magoli, they made us into slaves. Kasenga, they stopped slavery, they made us free. What is freedom if we must live to suit them and give up our old ways? Kasenga, new ways come, even by themselves. Even in Africa, things change. You can't stop them. This, at least, I suggest, was a gesture towards the African political figures that Solanke had asked for. By November 43, Solanke thought the revisions had rendered a much more, quote, realistic representation of African life. His mild satisfaction suggests he viewed the good African's pursuit of orchestral African music positively. Indeed, Shawande was well known at Wasso and was a relative of his. But even revised, The Witch Doctor remained unacceptable. Solanke objected that the film should not end, quote, with the destruction of the native medical institution. Rather, African medicine needed to live on, shaping ongoing medical practice. So Solanke upgraded his earlier request to have the plot feature a conservative Magoli engaging a, quote, liberally progressive Kasenga in debate. So the film could show, quote, the development of the Litu people on modern lines effected in a most happy way without the loss of anything. After the end of 1943, the record of these exchanges dries up, but conversations continued during shooting in East Africa and then in London in 1944 and 1945. Throughout, Dickinson recalled, always we had to prove that our film would be no Standards of the River, that bugbear of every educated person of color, end quote. Despite this, when the film finally debuted in 46, first in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania and then in London, it eroded the faint consensus apparent in 1943. Magoli reverts to being simply an illiterate witch doctor. The debate between Magoli and Kasenga almost disappears. Magoli merely expresses essential resistance to change, quote, we ask only to live as Africans. Kasenga only wants, quote, his people to learn all that my white friends can teach. Kasenga becomes mildly more impressive. His orchestral concert now acquires the title Baraza, which is the name of village meetings in East Africa, but his debt to Britain doubles. At the insistence of a colonial office official, his sojourn in Britain increased from 7 years to 15 years to account for his added artistic achievement. But most damaging, a dramatic revision to the good African rendered him fragile and unstable. Dickinson and Carey, it seems, could not let go of their faith that the colonizers' mission was to break Africa away from its dark past, and their filmmakers' need to make this break dramatic. Late in 1943, with the aid of a psychiatrist claiming to be, quote, an authority on racial behavior, they made Kasenga their patient and, quote, vetted his character development to make it psychologically authentic, end quote. Kasenga's anxiety, hinted at in the 1943 script, now became full-on psychological distress of alienation and identity loss. Upon return now from 15 years away, he's terrified crossing the crocodile-infested river on the rope bridge that leads to his childhood village, the bridge that had been cursed. He's ostracized by his villagers as a black white man. His parents disown him. He does stand up to Magoli, and this flips back and forth over the revisions, but without the DC's push.
Magoli! Mr. Schoolmaster, what can I do for you?
You wouldn't take the DC's challenge because he's a white man. You can't refuse mine. I am an African, a Litu. I challenge you.
Be careful, Schoolmaster. Suppose I agree, you will die quickly.
You see, he's afraid of my challenge too.
Afraid of you, Schoolmaster?
I challenge you. Bring the knife.
Kisanga, don't.
Hurry up. Hurry up with your mumbo jumbo. The moon is growing. In a week it will be full. As that moon wanes, you will grow sick. And when it dies, you will die. You will see he can do me no harm. He's a fraud and a liar. Hold his arm.
For all his bravery, while waiting for Magoli's death spell to take effect, Kisanga gradually sheds his European clothes, at one point running bare-chested through the moonlit jungle. He laments his alienation, quote, "But what am I? I thought I had two worlds. Now I have none at all." The curse brings on hallucinations depicting his inner crisis.
I'll hold him. You have Saburi. Trapped between Magoli and his drummers on one side, a European orchestra playing his baraza on the other, his arms turning white as he reaches for Magoli's death charm, battling his father as he goes to the piano, Kisanga cannot escape. The film ends with Kisanga emerging from Magoli's curse only when the village children, inspired by the DC, revive Kisanga by singing his music. As he revives, Magoli retreats into the bush defeated, but the audience is left doubting Kisanga's capacity to save Africa without outside help. Heavily promoted, both in Tanganyika and London on its release, the film remained an unhappy memory in the Colonial Office years later. One reason was the final cost. After multiple disasters in production, it rivaled the £500,000 of the entire 1945 Colonial Development and Welfare budget. They spent a ton of money on this. It was also a critical and commercial flop. But most important, it failed to rally Africans around a new vision of the future. The 1943 revisions resurfaced. The Times of London, reviewer took it as confirmation that when confronted with, quote, the white magic of stethoscope and education, darkest Africa slinks away into the bush, end quote. African activists objected to the film's Invented Africa, in which, quote, African savages believe in magic and witchcraft.
Wasu lamented that in spite of all their attempts at correcting the script, the filmmakers retained the fallacy of their plot and the wholly invented witch doctor. Kasenga's psychological fragility elicited fresh objections. The idea that an African educated abroad would be an alien at home was just another colonial invention. Speaking as first-hand experts, West Africans wrote to the Times saying they were not and never would be men of two worlds. But the impact spread far beyond its reception. The Wasu protests against the Colonial Office project inspired the Colonial Office to review non-theatrical films held in British libraries about African witchcraft. Many of them were now deemed misleading, and plans were made to remove them. 2 Colonial Film Unit documentaries in 1943 and 1945 finally presented actual Wasu members to the British public as real-life good Africans. Projects no doubt facilitated by Shawande. More powerfully, a 1948 short feature film made by the Crown Film Unit, the successor to the Colonial Film Unit, Daybreak Irudi, seemed to answer some West African concerns more wholeheartedly. To dramatize colonial development in action, the plot concerned African villagers, with government support, quote, teaching themselves to read and write, building schools, maternity homes, and many miles of road. They are finally starting to bridge the gap bridge the centuries dividing their way of life from ours, end quote. When the villagers meet to debate building a local maternity home, an elder, Eze, speaks vehemently against it. The villagers build the home anyway, but are then threatened in the film's climax.
You stay where you are. I'll see what it is.
Those were no witch doctors, only Eze and some other elders in ritual masquerade making one last stand against disruptive change. The film won an Academy Award and remains readily available online. To conclude, the West African activists' work to shape this major imperial propaganda project is not well captured as a story of direct resistance. The path from Bosambo to Eze, however insecure the change may have been, was anything but direct. Robertson constructed a new good African by appropriating a Grey to craft a largely familiar colonial culture character. Dickinson and Carey upgraded her character by appropriating ideas from the Pan-African message of Robeson's film and the cultural nationalist ambition of Shawande's music career. But their talented Kasenga, mildly acceptable to Shlenke, remained dependent, inspiring African courage to accept change rather than designing development. The witch doctor only became a problem when Shlenke insisted it was pure invention. But witch doctors were too essential to the dramatic needs of colonial adventure stories to be much changed. When Shlenke pushed to recast the film not as the epochal destruction of old Africa, but as a story featuring African critical agents building on Africa's cultural strength, this not only subverted the film's intended message, but removed the claim which justified colonial rule. So the good African had to become ever more indebted to his British tutors, but also a man lost between two worlds looking for wiser guidance. What exactly changed through all this? It's hard to pin down. My point is that the story of how it happened is important to figure out what happened. Tellingly, Although in the film, the ever-improved Kasenga had his African-influenced music played in the British National Gallery, in the real Imperial London, that scene had to be shot in studio because the National Gallery management would not allow an African to perform on site. The end.
Questions? I have a question to kick us off. I was wondering so were all of the films, did they open both in the US and the UK?
The original plan for Men of Two Worlds was to aim it actually at the American popular audience. That's why the Technicolor, because they were afraid in 1942 of American anti-imperialism. They were going to dismantle the British Empire as part of the victory in the war. But by the time the film comes out in 1946, that ambition had faded. It is produced and it's translated into various languages. They push it hard. They try for a long time to make it sell. Song of Freedom comes out under the name Big Fella in the States. And Sanders of the River, I assume, was the purpose of those Empire Cinema Productions was they sold big in America. British film industry was very afraid of getting swamped by Hollywood. And the reason, the Corder brothers in their various Empire films got a lot of official government support. They read the credits, they're thanking governor after governor after governor for helping them film there. And the British government was willing to do that and the British film industry, because they were trying to hold their own, and the Corder stuff sold well in the States.
I was wondering if you could speak to maybe the distinction in terms of the reception in the UK versus, I mean, you mentioned one that Men of Two Worlds won an Academy Award in the US.
Daybreak at Udi won an Academy Award.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, for a feature short, I guess. I haven't traced the reception in America because it might be very apparent to you that I'm not a film historian. I came into this looking for my intellectuals. I found this treasure trove in the archives of this, not just that the film existed, but I have a stack of revised scripts. I can trace month by month how they're talking, and I can correspond it to Shalenki's private papers in Lagos, and tie it into some stuff at what used to be called Rhodes House at Oxford. And I could kind of catch the conversation, and that's what I was focused on. So the reception, the history of the film so much wasn't my interest, although I had planned at one point to write a small book on this, like a second year or third year course book that you could kind of capture in one story all the things going on here at kind of Imperial London. That remains on my table somewhere. Sorry, I didn't answer your question, Justina, but. Chioma.
Local authorities, local cultures, customs, traditions to administer these areas because of what scholars have called shoestring budgets of the empire, not enough staff and so on. But then in the film series, in this context, you see British administrators trying to not now totally embrace this customs on which they were planning to build their administrations, trying to create or invent or construct an Africa that is more aligned to a British cultural vision or perspective. And it's, I don't know what to say, it's contradictory as usual in terms of colonial policy, but what do you think when you look at the system of indirectly, what it was meant to be, and then this whole propaganda, and as early as the 1930s, which was perhaps the peak of colonialism, and thereabout when the British Empire was building on local authorities depending on local authorities to administer their colonies. So why was it also important to create an African or an African culture, African traditions that represented more of, colonial visions of modernity?
But are you conflating kind of before and after the 1940 Colonial Development and Welfare Act? Because there's that, I argue the premise for this is, I think, a profound and sharp shift, at least in certain people. My predecessor here, John Flint, who found, whose job I now hold, was one of the first people to go into the archives when they opened, and it's a remarkable attempt to get rid of all the old guard, hire a bunch of new people, and have them come in with a Dickinson and Carey kind of attitude in which they want to dispense with the old views. So I argue you should see a discontinuity between the 30s and the 40s. But, I didn't make this clear in the talk very much, but policy was one thing, the cultural question was another, right? That there are different clocks, I would argue, right? And also a different logic, whereas the problems of administration, the problems of ditching the chiefs and picking up this partnership, junior partnership with the educated West Africans, had the problem of justifying the expense of colonial rule, right? How do you justify to the British public in 1940, and especially in 1945 when they passed the second Colonial Development and Welfare Act, spending £500,000 on those people when we're all starving, shortage of bread, rations, rebuilding from the Blitz and all that kind of stuff. And so that there's a kind of, that earlier Empire Cinema message, Africa needs saving, evil versus good, superstition versus science, all that kind of stuff, couldn't change at the same speed, right? I would suggest, as the like insider view that we need to discard all that stuff and try to bring Africans in, play the piano together, and have a drink, and treat them as equals. Does that answer your question? There's a lot of things happening, like from 38 to 48, and they're not just policy changes. They're, as I try to argue, not only a kind of cultural change unfolding, but a policy change being created. There's this money being spent to try to push this change along, right, from one kind of colonial justification to another. Never arguing, I mean, the case for African freedom, the title of Carey's pamphlet, is not African freedom from British rule, it's African freedom from disease, fear, and superstition. That's the freedom he's looking for.
Yeah, thank you. But that's interesting.
But not an answer to your question.
No, it's I mean, it's just trying to sell colonialism to the British or European public. Like, this is why we have to invest in this project, and why you don't have to be mad if we invest so much in, in Africa, in the colonies, and so on. But does that also explain why we don't get to see much of the warrant chiefs, for instance, playing a role in this film project? Because they want to use the witch doctor as the paramount narrative for why Africa needs saving. They were working with the warrant chiefs, or chiefs in Africa. Not that all the chiefs were complacent. They also met contests and negotiations here and there. But does that also explain why? Because I was looking for the chief in the context of the film, but it's either the witch doctor, the bad African, and
both in Miniature Worlds and in Daybreak at Udi, there are chief characters. That's a whole different story. But the interesting thing about Daybreak at Udi is that the chief is kind of agreeable to the whole project. He has to organize it. They have to build this thing themselves. There's a huge sequence where they're, bringing in building materials and putting up the walls and thatching the roof and stuff. But the key movers are young, educated villagers, right? And the key movers are women. The women who show up in that climactic scene I showed you are kind of the main characters, pushing for change, not against the chief, but against Eze, right? Who's an elder. So they figure, but again, I just get the sense that the idea of look at Bosambo. That's what I thought a chief was, right? So a warrant chief is not going to have much cinematic punch for anybody. But there is a literature on, this project, the Empire Film Project, End of Empire Film Project, which seems to have gone dead. The website's kind of non-functional, where you could explore that. It's just not, I didn't have time for it. We can talk about it later. Dr. Paris. Thank you. Glad you could make it.
I mean, so many things were swirling through my head as I watched and listened and took this in. And I think in trying to frame my question, a little bit building on Gioma, I'm reminded, I know it's not from the right part of the world, but I'm reminded of Ami Césaire and Discourse on Colonialism when he's talking about museums and museum artifacts and says, we can quibble over whether or not, X person should run a museum or return artifacts. But the bigger question is, what do we need a museum for at all? If these cultures had actually met as equals fundamentally. And it strikes me in looking, like I'm thinking about WASU in particular, the student union that was brought in, if I'm understanding you correctly, brought in to advise on a script and then systematically had all of their advice thrown out.
Well, they insisted that they would not help find, the character they're looking for was Saburi, Kasenga's sister. And they weren't going to help them find an African woman in London who could act unless they got to look at the script.
And they didn't let them? Or they did?
No, that's why the whole correspondence is back and forth. Yeah, the script is, and multiple revisions of the script are reviewed by Solanke.
I guess what strikes me then is, and I'd love to know your thoughts on this, is that, in this period, in the 30s and 40s in London, the African figures, the Caribbean figures, the Indian figures, they're all these kind of post-colonial elite class folks. So their particular understanding and rendering of modernity, it strikes me as it's so inflected, but regardless of the trope that we're looking at, it's still that colonial trope. And I'm wondering if there's any sense of, or like remembrance of what, like an actual West African understanding of modernity, all as something not separate to, because I accept your argument that there is no exception, like there's just different ways of understanding and engaging with modernity, but I guess even the witch doctor and the good and the bad African all strikes me as profoundly British imperial tools. And I get very little sense of what's happening in Africa from African perspective. Do you know what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah, and it's elusive. But first, I made this point briefly. They're not trying, the game that they have to play is using the images of colonial power to engage and try to change colonial power. So they have to talk the imagery that they're given, right? Solanke can't just throw anything into the script. He's got to build on what the script is. So that's part of I call that the colonial intellectual's dilemma. You've got to use the language of power to fight the language of power, and that means you only have certain ideas to work with, right? The second part of your question, as I understand it, is a sense of other visions. My first response to that is come to terms with the kind of when, right? West Africa has been engaged with the Atlantic economy since the beginning of the Atlantic economy. It's been changing that whole time. We can't go into how many changes are going on. So there's a long conversation as far as we can reconstruct it about what they thought of those changes, what they thought about this being bad, this being good, we want that, we don't want that, right? So there's no right, except there's a long story of always moving ideas. And these guys are at one point of that moving story. So this idea that there's some kind of, going back to something that's innocent of European contact, innocent of the Atlantic economy, innocent of the slave trade and all the other trades, it just isn't there, right? My position would be, we need to understand this as a historical process and get away from this idea of kind of a moment before it changed.
But at some point, the context in which they are operating changed, and at some point in that long history, there's the rise of race science, anti-black racism, and the industrialization of slavery. So and they're part of that, absolutely. I see how it's all part of that. But I guess what I was getting at wasn't necessarily a period of innocence, but a period of sort of substantive difference in opinion, in intellectual reasoning? And it's an unfair question because you're looking at these artifacts and you're in
Yeah,
the archive, so.
You know Anthony Apter's book, the title has just escaped me, about Ife priests in Yoruba? That was his question. He wanted to find a way to get after what Africans were thinking critically. He argues that the Ife Oracle was a critical philosophical discourse, and he argues it's being conducted through this whole period we're talking about in Yoruba terms. And it's a convincing argument, but it's heavily weighted to the late 19th and early 20th century because of sources. He's an anthropologist by training. And that's the kind of stuff, for sure, you could find diverse ways in which Africans had critical ideas about what to do with change, how to respond to the things that were flowing around them. He has to keep it as a Yoruba answer because it's tied to Yoruba ritual and Yoruba mythical knowledge. So the Africa evaporates again, right? The Africa only kind of exists in Black London, right? Africa makes a lot more sense in London than it does in West Africa. I mean, I use Black London, just so you know. It's a title of a book that I think is really great called Black London by Mark Matera, about these characters in London and the kind of world in which what he argues is, the argument of the book is the kind of social life and the structure and the kind of all the material realities, as it were, of London from like 35 to 48 or so, actually were the substrata which generated Black internationalism. It couldn't have happened anywhere else. It was a product of exactly being at the center of the empire, and it kind of dissipates when the conditions change. So Justina's class and I were talking about this earlier today, about categories here are, you need to be careful, right? Who wants an African voice, right? Who wants to be able to tag something as an African voice? I can see why, but you want to think about based on what, right? I would like to find voices. I like Apter's work in terms of this idea of things we had dismissed as being kind of ritual or kind of by memory. He makes a really strong argument there, had all the concepts in place to make a critical discourse of, well, how should Yoruba ideas of kingship and authority change as the economy changes? Stuff like that. So do we agree to disagree or what?
I don't think I disagree. I agree to be persuaded.
Okay. Dr. Bingham.
Spoiler alert, I don't know how to ask this question. But as I was watching this, the music jumped at me a couple of times, especially the hallucination scene. And then when Easy is running this. And so I was wondering, is there unpacking that has to happen there? Because in lots of ways, musical tropes in film instantly set, like they subconsciously register, right? What's the American Indian theme? Da 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 da. That's all you have to show. And I'm interested in the swirl of influences and who's writing it and who's performing it.
Just like the opening shot in the National Gallery had to be filmed in the studio, no one was ever considered for the Kasenga character who was West African. Orlando Martins, who plays Magole, goes on to a great career in British film and television, plays a lot of different things. And the musicians, right? So they have Shawande on board, they have Samuel Coleridge available as his kind of African orchestral music. Both of the themes for Men of Two Worlds and Daybreak at Uni were written and celebrated, and you could buy the record of it. Was promoted at the time by British composers with kind of it's just kind of obnoxious given the story I've told that they didn't turn to Shawande, who was right there in the room, right? Writing this kind of music and launching his very successful career. But no, so as far as I know, they were written for these films. They were written, I haven't found any archival kind of trace of what they were looking for, but I'm thinking both, especially Men of Two Worlds, but also Daybreak, were driven by cinematic soundtrack kind of logic where you needed the swelling music and the whatever drums feature in ways that they presumed to be African. All of these films, actually, Song of Freedom has long footages of African music in the streets, in the village compound, in the village square. In Daybreak at Udi, just for no reason whatsoever, the DC, who was actually a DC, he was actually a real colonial officer, just kind of is leaving the village meeting and says, "Chief, let's have a song." and the villagers get to get up and dance and drum and stuff. For no reason in the plot, it was part of what was expected to have Africans doing African music. Seen, I think, as a kind of a celebration of, in Daybreak at Udi, as a positive presentation of vitality or something. So I don't think I answered your question either. But it is striking to me that the soundtracks were commissioned from British composers.
It's remarkable how quickly those signifiers get seeded.
And Song of Freedom is one of Paul Robeson's most famous songs. It's recorded, it makes him a lot of money, you can buy the album. And it's got, I get no Africa from it, right? It's very much in the line of, well, it's no Africa. It doesn't have along the lines of Shawande or Coleridge Taylor's work. It's very much in the tradition of his African-American spiritual singing. It's a great song. He's got a great voice. He sings it repeatedly and he also sings a song in Sanders of the River about the rivermen, the boatmen. Oh, Jim.
How are you doing?
I haven't seen you for a while.
It's the mask. It's always the mask. I enjoyed your presentation very much. Some of these films are ones I've not seen before. And what I'm wondering about is, you talked about Wasu, you put a lot of emphasis, and I noticed that Yoruba names come up fairly often. And I'm just wondering to what extent these films are a struggle between the British and what essentially would be coastal, urban West Africans. In other words, what it's conveying is what is going on in the southern parts of places like Ghana and Nigeria, as opposed to British rule in the northern part. And that kind of image of whether it's Mr. Johnston or any one of the various literature as well as films that have been made, have always seemed to be from that particular perspective. So following on that, and I know you said you're not a film historian, is there any comparable film about the northern parts of these West African English-speaking countries?
As in
modernization in terms of changing a Muslim society as opposed to a society that is becoming increasingly Christianized?
As in colonial film unit kind of documentaries? Yeah, there are numerous ones. Do you know this website? I wrote a chapter for a book that came out of this colonial film project and film of the end of empire. They had a wonderful website, I guess the funding has run out, where they had bazillion graduate students writing up annotations and backgrounds. And they collected all the films they could from the War Museum and the British Film Institute and the Colonial Office. And so when it was live, you can still go to the website and you can find the titles, and sometimes you can find these films on YouTube. But sure, there's what's it called, 1948 or so, maybe 52, where they actually start in the south of Ghana and they go up the map and they get to the Islamic north and they present it as a story in the colonial development and welfare kind of framework. Is the coast is getting civilized, but the north, wow, we got a lot of work to do up there. We're not going to be able to leave these people for a long, long time. They go to great lengths to make them look as mud-hutted and naked as they can. So there's that kind of story. But the other one would be, of course, the celebration of northern Nigeria, which is celebrated as a success. We have passed the baton, right? And we can give these people, the keys because, they actually, celebrate the history of Hausa civilization in this film. Also around 48 or so. So there are. Like I said to Justina, this Men of Two Worlds film is generated with that in the context of an American audience. That was the kind of the thing that got the money for it in 1942. So that makes sense. They would present an Africa on the coastal Africa, right, which was the familiar Africa in the American imagination, the Tarzan Africa. Right? So there's a huge. There's 2 volumes in that Film and Empire project and that wonderful website that used to be wonderful. It really does a good job of exploring the excitement of film in the 30s and 40s. How everybody thought film was the most powerful thing as a culture shaper ever.
Generally speaking, though, my sense of it is, it's not that surprising. What they actually produce isn't that surprising or nuanced or breaking down into the kind of divisions that you would see, except insofar as it could serve like the case. We got to keep Ghana for a long time because look at the north, and we can, you know, retreat from Nigeria because look at the north.
But the look at the north was basically the view from the British, the white gaze, so to speak, as opposed to this dramatization, which is a mixture of the white gaze and Wasit. In terms of telling these stories, you don't get a similar storytelling happening in the north, in the Muslim north of West Africa. Aside from propaganda.
No, but you do have the kind of Colonial Film Office project being transferred over to the Nigerian government in 1960, where they try to do that stuff with them. There's a student who never finished her PhD. She went off to write it at York. That was going to look at the propaganda projects of the Nigerian government after 1960, trying to convince the British public about what they really wanted the British public to know. And I would love someone to do that project, kind of the ways in which the Nigerian government took film in their own hands and tried to reverse this whole story. I don't think I answered your question either.
Thank you, Professor Zachernuk.
Thank you all.
And thank you all. Thank you for spending your Valentine's evening with us. Happy Valentine's Day. I should have brought chocolate.